overseas, and I think the appropriate thing to do would be totally defer to the senator from Massachusetts. He's got a very tight schedule here, and I can wait a little longer.
Well, Mr. President, I'm very, very grateful to my colleague. I was happy to wait, but I'm grateful to him, and I thank the senator from Montana, my friend, Senator Baucus. Mr. President, I've been privileged to work with a lot of extraordinary staff members, as we all are here, and we often say that none of us are any better than what our staff allow us to be. But it's rare that I've had somebody on my team who predated my time in the United States Senate. I've been here, this is my 28th year now. Mary Tarr, who I'd like to say a few words about, is my office manager up until today, a veteran staffer of 31 years here in the Senate, and she's about to retire and look forward to going into the grandmother business over the course of these next years after 3 decades here. I think sometimes people miss or aren't aware of the difference that an office manager can make in a Senate office, and it's hard to quantify sometimes, but without any negative inference to the Senate itself in drawing this analogy that is, you know, sort of a prison and inmates analogy, a great manager is a little bit like the character Red in the movie Shawshank Redemption. In that movie, Red is described as somebody, the guy who can get stuff, not unlike the sergeant in Catch-22. There are always these special people who know how to make things appear out of nowhere and make everything work. Well, that is exactly the quality that Mary Tarr has brought to my office over these years, a mix of relationships, building relationships, institutional memory, and a lot of guile at times, and they get things done. And so since the summer of 1997, when she came aboard in my office, Mary has literally been my Red in my office. And over the course of nearly 15 years, no matter what I needed, no matter what the office needed, no matter what we needed to get done, she managed to make that happen. I must say I was very lucky, Mr. President, because I didn't have the ability to show her any tricks. She taught me the tricks. And the reason is that she came to me already a master of Senate procedure. I was privileged to be the 5th United States Senator that she worked for, and for 15 years, I might add. Before me, she'd split her assignments down the middle between Democrats and Republicans. She worked for Patty Murray, she worked for Brock Adams, and she worked for Republicans, Jim Abner and Charles Percy. She knew this place, she has always loved this place, and she knew pretty much everybody who worked here. She did all the things that you need to do to make the trains run on time, kept the records, maintained the office accounts, prepared the budget, kept the payroll, pre-audited expenses, ordered supplies, made sure we were in compliance with all the rules, requirements and procedures, and followed them as they changed as we tie ourselves in various knots with various requirements we dump on ourselves. She was my liaison with the Senate Sergeant-at-Arms Office, the Senate Dispersing Office, the Senate Service Department, the Senate Computer Center, an extraordinary amount of work, and she performed the endless tasks that all of us here understand are critical to enabling our offices to be able to work. Much more complex than, obviously, the average citizen ever sees. She wrote the emergency evacuation manual for my staff after 9/11. She trained the staff on emergency procedures. And she restructured and ran what I think is one of the best if not the best internship program in the United States Senate, for which the summer interns at the end of the summer got to have a terrific intern pool party at her home. Office managers all over the Senate constantly consulted her on how to run an effective intern program, and she was always ready to help because she understood how important it was for young interns to have a positive experience, and part of that came out of the fact that she was only 17 when she came to work full-time for the United States Senate, younger, obviously, than some of the interns who come here and work with us. When I said she could do the impossible, she helped me move my office, not once but twice, which is an enormous undertaking here in the Senate. and she has worked for the Senate, Mr. President, since 1981. In those 31 years, I will tell you, she's become a fixture on Capitol Hill, well known by everybody, perhaps legendary with some. If you needed a room at the last minute to host a function, people would call Mary Tarr, from outside of our office, I might add. If you needed a desk repaired or a light repaired or air conditioning working, and just mention it. And mention Mary's name, and people would say right away. Printing, my legislative director tells me a story of how he went to get some printing done, and the folks at the Senate printing office said, "Did Mary okay this?" Extra ice cream at the great ice cream party that we have in May, the Dirksen Buffet, she'd just say, "Go in and ask for the Mary special," and they made it. Everybody seemed to know Mary, from the hundreds of former interns that she mentored over the years who are now working in government or public service, to Bill Gates, who once conveyed a hello from Mary to a former colleague in Patty Murray's office. So hundreds of American soldiers, I might add, stationed abroad have received care packages from Mary, the daughter of a wounded Vietnam veteran. Mr. President, in my Senate offices, I have a shelf of scrapbooks filled with emails, letters, and photos from soldiers who have received care packages, Christmas stockings, Easter baskets, Halloween candy, all of which Mary has organized and shipped year after year. And the words of those soldiers underscore just how important Mary has been to them. Our former intern, Army Second Lieutenant Rory McGovern, wrote, "It always helps to have a piece of home come in the mail." Army Private Jacob Adkins, "I appreciate the fact that someone who I don't even know supports me enough to send a care package. You make me proud to serve." From Marine Battalion Chaplain Captain Pat Opp, "Little things go a long way with morale. Send more lemonade. The troops mix it with cold water as the temperature is super hot over here." Army Major James Maloney, upon receiving clothes, school supplies, and personal grooming items to share with the children in a women's clinic in Afghanistan, wrote, "It has done wonders for our interaction with the local population." All of that organized every time by Mary Tarr. One of my favorite emails in the scrapbooks comes not from a soldier, but from a Marine's mother, Kathy Lavin, whose son Ryan had received one of our care packages. Kathy wrote to tell Mary that she can finally get a good night's sleep because of the message she just received from Ryan. And Ryan wrote, "It's almost time to take the candle out of the window, Mom. I'm coming home. I love and miss you." So how did Mary Tarr come to spend a care package to Ryan? So typical of Mary. She was in Massachusetts attending the funeral of a friend, and while there, she went into a shop in Hull to buy a gift for her mother and father, Carolyn and Tom Corby. Mary chose a Marine Corps kite for her dad, who received a Purple Heart in Vietnam, and Ryan's mother was in the shop and asked Mary if she had a Marine because of what she was buying. Mary told her she was a Marine Corps brat and the kite was for her father. But she asked if Kathy had a Marine. And when Kathy told her about Ryan, Mary immediately wrote the information down, got his address, and then seeing her job through, like every single one she's ever undertaken, she stayed in touch with Ryan until he came home. I think, I personally know how important those packages are. And I will tell you that one of the things I'm proudest of is what Mary has done on behalf of her country, and certainly those of us who make decisions to send people into combat. And I'm proud of her. Mr. President, she may be retiring, but she's got enormous plans ahead of her. She and her husband, Brian, are planning to move to Roswell, Georgia, where her daughter, Angela, and her husband, Daniel, live. And Mary jokes that Angela and Daniel may be the only two Democrats in the whole town of Roswell, so the arrival of Mary and Brian will double our party's strength there. But Angela's going to have a baby in October, so there's hope even for Roswell yet. Her plan is to babysit her new grandson for a few years, and then eventually she and Brian are going to retire to Florida, where daughters Chrissy and Lindsay are in college. So no matter where she goes or how far from Capitol Hill, She is always going to be a very special part of the family here, the extended Senate family. She has always represented our Senate well. She's extremely hardworking, honest, bright, conscientious, knowledgeable, and she's handled her responsibilities with great dedication. I think she's viewed every challenge as an opportunity to prove herself, and she did that again and again. So, Mr. President, as she departs my staff today, the principles that represented her in her work and the standards she established are going to remain for a long time as a guide to those in our office and here in the Senate. And we say thank you to her for all she has done for our country, for the state of Massachusetts, for me personally. And I wish her and Brian and her family the very best as they take on a new chapter in their lives. Thank you, Mr. President. Again, I thank my colleague from Montana. Thanks, man. Mr. President.
Senator from Montana.
Mr. President, I want to compliment the Senator from Massachusetts for taking so much time to praise a person who clearly deserves praise, who's worked so hard for him and for the people of Massachusetts and for her country. Clearly, Mary is an incredible lady. Mr. President, my Mary is Maureen. Maureen, too, was someone who started work for me when she's very young, 17 years old. 1974, 75, don't know exactly when. I was hiring people, and this little young girl came to my office. I could tell this young girl knows the meaning of work. She's Catholic, Irish Catholic, and this lady knows the meaning of hard work. I hired her on the spot. She is my office manager. She's with me even to this date. She's tough. She's smart. She organizes. She's the glue. She's a super, super lady. We all have our Marys. We have our Marines. And I want to this moment just to praise Mary Marine, but also all those who work so hard for us in so many different capacities. Mr. President, the renowned poet and author Maya Angelou wrote, and I quote, "History, with all its unending pain, cannot be outlived, but faced with courage need not be lived again." I stand here today to once again lend my strong support, voted for, as the majority of our colleagues did, for the Violence Against Women Act. Nearly 2 decades ago, the Congress underwent an exhaustive investigation on the extent and severity of domestic violence and sexual assault toward women in this country. In hearing after hearing, senators heard from experts, including prosecutors, victim advocates, and physicians, and real-life stories of women that were the victims of these crimes. In response, Congress passed the Violence Against Women Act in 1994. This law quite literally changed the culture in our country. It changed how we view and address domestic violence and sexual assault. States across our country began to enact laws making stalking a crime and strengthened criminal rape statutes. Congress provided states with resources to train law enforcement and coordinate services related to domestic violence and sexual assault. But despite the progress we have made, our work is not done. 1 in every 4 women will experience domestic violence during her lifetime. In my home state of Montana, 98 people died from domestic violence between 2000 and 2010. These are not simply statistics. They are our mothers, our sisters, our daughters, our friends. They're people close to us. Since the passage of the Violence Against Women Act, women reporting domestic violence has increased by 51%, and the rate of non-fatal intimate partner violence against women has decreased by 53%. Congress renewed this critical legislation in the year 2000, again 2005. Both measures included improvements, and both those passed the Senate unanimously. We are here today to reiterate our commitment to addressing violence against women, including domestic abuse, sexual assault, dating violence, and stalking. I was struck recently by the story in the Billings Gazette, it's Billings, Montana, of Maria Martin. Maria was a victim of partner abuse. In the year 2005, the man she was dating went into a jealous rage. He held her hostage in her own home with a knife to her throat. He also threatened to kill her 3 daughters. Charges were filed. This man is now serving a 61-year prison term. Maria went on. She went on to earn her master's degree in rehabilitation and mental health counseling. She now helps others who find themselves in the situation she was in just a few short years ago. Maria told the reporter that programs created under the Violence Against Women Act provided her with the resources and support to overcome her situation. The act helped her find the courage she needed to see that this painful experience did not have to be lived again. It's counseling, shelter for abused women, and law enforcement counseling, where law enforcement can be more sensitive to women who are victims of domestic violence. The bipartisan reauthorization renews grant programs critical to Montana, including those that support law enforcement, victim services, and prevention programs. And the bill consolidates 13 programs, many of which overlap into 4. This consolidation reduces administration costs, adds efficiency. Acknowledging the current fiscal realities, the bill therefore reduces authorization levels by 17% overall. It's more effective and it costs less. The bill also makes critical changes to address the pervasive domestic violence occurring in Indian country. Native Americans represent about 6% of Montana's population, about 6%. Yet Native women account for over 13% of victims reporting domestic violence in my state in the year 2008, more than 2 times. According to the Department of Justice, Native women are 2.5 times more likely to be a victim of rape or sexual assault compared with non-Native women. However, it is the federal courts, not the tribal courts, which have jurisdiction over many of these crimes, including misdemeanor cases. With federal prosecutors stretched thin, especially in large rural states like Montana, many cases go uninvestigated and criminals walk free to continue their violence with no repercussions. Chairman Leahy's bill carefully crafts a measure to extend concurrent criminal tribal jurisdiction to address the issue of domestic violence and partner abuse occurring in Indian country. These provisions will give tribal courts narrow jurisdiction to prosecute domestic violence or dating partner violence occurring on tribal land. The bill, however, safeguards those who might be defendants, provides safeguards to ensure that the defendant receives all rights guaranteed by the United States Constitution. This includes Fourth Amendment protections against search and seizure, Fifth Amendment privilege against self-incrimination, and Sixth Amendment right to effective assistance of counsel, all guaranteed in this statute. 50 law professors from across the country, including the University of Montana, wrote to Chairman Leahy in support of these provisions and Congress's constitutional authority to extend tribal jurisdiction. These provisions will begin to address the violence against Native women that has reached epidemic proportions. Maya Angelou is right that we cannot erase the past and what happened to Maria and others like her. But Maria's courage is proof that we can change these circumstances for others, to see that no one has to live through this experience. Maria said, and I'll quote her, "I'm alive today because I am a strong, intelligent woman. I need to stand up, step out, and be in front of this issue for others who can't or are not yet able to do it, at least not yet." End quote. So I urge my colleagues to support me in making sure that this act follows through in negotiations with the House and we get this reauthorization passed. It is so important to so many people in our country. I yield the floor.
Mr. President.
Senator from Rhode Island.
Mr. President, after months of working to ensure student loan interest rates don't double this summer, I think we've finally reached a consensus that that position is absolutely correct, that middle-income families in America can't afford a huge increase, a doubling of the interest rates on student loans. Those who were previously opposed or indifferent to our proposal now are in favor of stopping a doubling of rates. The most prominent, of course, is the former governor of Massachusetts, Mitt Romney, who said, "I fully support the effort to extend the low interest rate on student loans." I think that is the consensus. It's hard-fought. I submitted the legislation originally in January, and now we've reached that consensus. But the debate has now shifted to how do we pay for it. What I have proposed, and joined by many colleagues, has been to close a loophole that has allowed a self-selected few to avoid paying their fair share of payroll taxes. The alternatives proposed on the other side go to critical health care benefits to low and middle-income families. It seems to me entirely unfair to try to provide help to middle-income families by taking away their access to health care. For families that are struggling, education and health care are not something that are can be avoided, can be traded one for the other. Mr. President, Congress should not raise the interest rate on these loans. We've reached that. It's a fact, a de facto tax on middle-income families. And we have put forward a plan will avoid the doubling of the interest rates on student loans, and we'll pay for it in a responsible way. We are offering a short-term solution to a long-term problem, but we have to begin, we have to do it quickly. If we don't act before July 1st, these loans will double for every loan granted thereafter. Our proposal, and I think it's very important, because we have proposed to close a loophole that the General Accounting Office has identified as glaring and, frankly, not substantiated by any need. This loophole involves S corporations, and immediately when you say S corporation, you think of, well, it must be the local manufacturer or the hardware store, and how can we go ahead and impose any further taxes or any further cost on these job creators? Well, this is not the situation. What has happened is that a very clever, adroit group of people have figured out a way to use the S corporation to avoid payroll taxes. It's a small subset of corporations that are doing this. And our proposal is targeted. It's targeted only to those S corporations that derive 75% or more of their gross revenue from the services of 3 or fewer shareholders, or where the S corporation is a partner in a professional service business. So essentially, this is a small group of people who derive 75% or more of their gross revenues from services. It's lawyers, accountants, lobbyists, and folks like that. The proposal only applies to S corporations or partnerships in the fields where virtually all the individual earnings are attributable to the performance of services. This is not the local manufacturer, not the local hardware store, not the local dry cleaner or gas station. These are people who perform essentially professional services. They are avoiding their payroll taxes, and we don't think that should be the case. Furthermore, this proposal exempts S-Corp shareholders, partners, and partnerships with modified adjusted gross incomes below $250,000 for joint filers and $200,000 for individuals. So it is targeted within this small subsection to an even smaller group, those who are making $250,000 as joint filers or $200,000 as sole filers. This proposal prevents professional service income from being mischaracterized to avoid employment taxes. Legitimate passive income, if the S corporation is earning income from rents, from dividends, from interest, and certain other gains, that would be essentially treated as such and will continue to be exempt from payroll taxes. So, Mr. President, what we have done is closed a glaring loophole, done it in a way which we don't impact anyone making under $200,000, anyone, frankly, who's involved in a corporation whose principal activities are not professional services. And I think this is a responsible way to do it, and this is a way that can, in fact, respond to the need to responsibly fund this provision for student interest. The GAO found that in 2003 and 2004 tax years, individuals used this loophole to underreport over $23 billion in wage income. The median underreported amount was $20,127. For most students, that would cover tuition. So let me say this again, that what the GAO found was that using this device of a S corporation, people were able to transform what normally would be $20,000 in payroll wages or salary that would be subject to payroll taxes into a distribution from the S corporation, avoiding payroll taxes. This is a loophole. There's no other word for it. And we're closing it. And we're closing in a way that is responsible and that will have virtually no impact on the businesses on Main Street, USA. In fact, I think if you had tried to explain to anyone running the local store that there are some folks out there that were using S Corporation to avoid their payroll taxes, they would be, if not shocked, at least mildly raise objections to that practice, frankly. So closing this loophole will fully offset the $5.9 billion cost of this one-year extension of the interest rate and would make the tax code more fair. It's a win-win proposition. In fact, according to Citizens for Tax Justice, in their words, closing this loophole will actually help most small businesses, which are currently subsidizing the minority who abuse it to avoid payroll taxes. And so I think this is not only the right thing to do in terms of the policy of not doubling the interest rate on student loans, this is an appropriate way to do it, an appropriate way to pay for it. Now, even Governor Romney recognizes that at times S corporations have to pay their fair share. And this is a quote from the Boston Herald of January 6, 2008. When Mitt Romney became governor in 2003, subchapter S corporations that were owned by Massachusetts Business Trust were taxed at 5.3%. By the time Romney left office, the tax rate on these corporations had climbed to 9.8%, with Romney declaring the tax increase to be merely, quote, closing loopholes. Well, we are urging that the governor be consistent both in his support for avoiding the increase in student interest and closing loopholes in Chapter S corporations. Both parties must work to find a way to do this. The good news is that there's now a consensus that it must be done, and I'm prepared, and I hope my colleagues are prepared to work for a way to pay for it, which is fair, which does not take from one middle-class program to offset another middle-class program. We should work together to get this done as soon as we return, and with that, Mr. President, I would yield the floor.
Senator from Missouri.
Mr. President, I have obviously been very fortunate to have the opportunity to give remarks from my desk on the floor of the United States Senate several times since the people of Missouri sent me here in 2006. And I don't think I've ever had a speech that I was going to give that was easier and harder than this speech. Easy in that I'm talking about somebody I love. Hard because this person I love is going on to a different place and a brighter future, and I'm going to miss her terribly. This person's name is Angela Ellsbury, and she has a job that people outside of Congress don't fully appreciate. She's called the scheduler. But for anybody who does this work, they appreciate that somehow that title just doesn't do it justice. Now, I don't know what the right title would be. I can think of several. In charge of my life. Handholder. The nicest person that has to say no. Multitasker. Mother to the entire office. Disciplinarian. Jokester. There are so many things that a good scheduler does that makes our lives work. Angela came to this work having worked for the governor in Missouri in a similar capacity. She actually joined my campaign and was one of the first ones through the door. And she came from a place that, frankly, hadn't had a lot of people that were elbow to elbow with governors and United States senators. She came from a small town called Madison, Missouri, and I think there's maybe just north of 500 people that live in Madison. So not only did she begin the campaign and do a lot at the beginning of the campaign, keeping us organized and allowing the schedule to work, she came to Washington and really has done remarkable work. Her work is so remarkable that everybody kind of thought it was easy. And that's the mark of a really good scheduler, because it is the hardest job in the office. Not only does she have to put up with the frustration of me when the hours are long and the meetings are back-to-back and there's not time to get a breath, she has to put up with everyone in Missouri that can't understand why I can't be 5 places at one time and why it's not possible for me to vote 1 hour and be in Rolla, Missouri the next hour. And she does all that with incredible grace and intellect and a smile on her face. She's just a very, very special person. And, you know, the thing about these jobs is, you know, there are days I get worried about our democracy. And then I look at the resumes of the young people, whether it's the great pages that service morning, noon, and night here in the chamber, or whether it's the amazing people that I work with in my office. And these are people that could go other places in the private sector and make a lot of money. They choose to come here. They're drawn to this. They're drawn to their government. They're drawn to public service. And so as a result, I mean, what do I love about my job? Let me count the ways, but one of the things I love most is being surrounded by patriotic, intellectual Americans that want to do the right thing and don't care that they have to still live like they're in college, that don't care that the idea of buying a car is a fantasy because it's just too expensive, that don't care that they have to have an hour commute in order to get housing that they can afford. They want to be a part of it. I am surrounded by a team like that. But in the driver's seat, kind of making the car go where it needs to go and making sure it doesn't get broken down on the side of the road has been Angela. And I'm not sure exactly how this car is going to navigate without her. I have a feeling that we're going to have a few bumps. There may be an out-and-out collision. There may be some scrapes and some wailing and some hollering about people who are upset or it doesn't work. I do know this, that we always say some of these shoes are hard to fill. These shoes, they will be very hard to fill. And I yield the floor.
The senator from Utah.
I ask and ask consent that I be permitted to give the speech in full.
Without objection.
Mr. President, I rise today to discuss the impending tax hike, which, if allowed to occur, will raise taxes on practically all Americans come January 1st, 2013. That is only 8 months from now. Earlier in February, the Washington Post called the approximately $500 billion tax hike Tax-Mageddon. And Federal Reserve Chairman Ben Bernanke described it as a massive fiscal cliff when testifying before Congress. This tax hike will affect virtually every single federal income taxpayer. We must not allow this to happen. America is slowly recovering from one of the greatest recessions in modern history. We remain in a precarious economic situation with a fragile recovery. It is beyond irresponsible for President Obama to sit idly by and allow this scheduled $500 billion tax hike to occur. Congress needs to act now in order to prevent this tax hike on America. First, we need to focus on the tax expenders. Just look at the first line as tax expenders. We've had hearings, no markup, no floor debate on that. Tax extenders are temporary tax provisions affecting everything from individuals and businesses to charitable giving, energy, and even disaster relief. My colleague from Montana, Senator Baucus, and I held a hearing in late January to discuss these tax provisions and the fact that Congress year after year continues to extend these provisions without a thorough review of each of those provisions. Some of these provisions are worthy of being extended, such as the Research and Development Tax Credit. I've introduced legislation with the chairman, my friend from Montana, to make this provision permanent. But when it comes to tax extenders, we need to have a real debate, one where the Senate decides which provisions must be extended and which should be allowed to expire. Second, we need to address the alternative minimum tax, 2012 AMT patch. Now, you notice we haven't had hearings, we haven't had a markup, we haven't had any floor debate on it. The AMT, or alternative minimum tax, was initially drafted to provide some type of guarantee that higher income taxpayers who owed little or no taxes under the regular income tax due to tax preferences would still pay some taxes. There were 155 of these at the time. Today we're approaching well over 30 million people who could get stung by this particular tax. Yet over the time, I've just said, this tax has grown into a monster, potentially ensnaring more and more middle-income families every year. To avoid the consequences of the AMT on the middle class year after year, Congress has patched the AMT. We have indexed the AMT for inflation so that middle-income families do not get caught up paying this tax. Not only must we patch the AMT for 2012, we must eliminate the AMT in the long term. It really doesn't deserve to exist. Now, third, we have to focus on death tax reform. That's very, very important. Taxing people's assets upon their death is just plain wrong. The death tax affects thousands of small business owners every year. This year alone, it is estimated that 3,600 estates will be affected. In 10 years, approximately 83,200 estates will be hit with this tax, according to the Joint Committee on Taxation. The President likes to talk about how his policies will help small businesses. Well, if current law expires, the number of small business owners who will face the death tax will rise by 900%. The number of farmers who will face the death tax will rise by 2,200%. That's right, 2,200%. Many individuals work their entire lives to build a business, and they reasonably want to pass that business along to their families. Instead of being rewarded for their work and the work of their families, this is what they face come January 1st, 2013, as you can see. Uncle Sam will take over 50% of their assets, 55% to be exact. The survivors of the deceased will be forced to sell land or assets of the business to meet this liability. Let me be clear. Nobody should be forced to sell a single asset in order to meet the arbitrary tax date or tax due date. Company assets should not have to be sold to pay taxes. The market should determine when things are bought and sold. And that is the best measurement, when a willing buyer meets a willing seller and they agree on a price and a time where a company should be sold. Currently, the law states that there is an exemption equivalent of $5 million and a tax rate of 35% on the remaining estate. In 2013, the exemption equivalent will drop to $1 million and the top tax rate will be a full 55%. That's a 57% increase in taxes. The truth is that we ought to repeal the death tax in its entirety. The whole thing must go. And I'm working hard to make that a reality. Unfortunately, with the current composition of the Senate, that is going to be an uphill climb. Yet at a minimum, we must extend the current provisions to keep a tax hike from occurring on these job creators. Now, I have to say, it's a pity that farmers and small business people have to, their survivors have to sell the farm or the small business in order to pay the death taxes. It's pitiful that we allow that, and we don't get that much revenue from death taxes. Fourth, and most important, we've got to prevent the 2013 tax hikes. Now, we have to extend the tax relief signed into law by President Bush and extended by President Obama. This may be the most crucial piece of legislation Congress passes this year, if not during the entire 112th Congress. If we allow these cuts to expire, as scheduled at the end of the year, almost every federal income tax payer in America will see an increase in their rates. Some will see a rate increase of 9%, while others will see a rate increase of 87%. Let's take the average American family of four earning $50,000. This family will owe an additional tax of $2,183. Democrats insist that that is fair. That is just more people paying more of their fair share. But to whom? And for what? What this means in reality is that instead of taxpayers using their $2,183 to pay for their children's education, save for retirement, buy a new home, or invest in a new business, they will be forking that $2,183 over to the federal government. And after winding its way through the federal bureaucracy, some pittance of that $2,183 will be spent on a federal program that too often has a zero demonstrated success. Let's not sugarcoat this. In the supposed interest of fairness, families will have an additional $2,183 taken from their wallets in order to serve bigger government. Now, that's people earning $50,000 a year. That is the impact on families and businesses of President Obama's redistributionist agenda. Looking at this problem more broadly, economists estimate that if these current policies were allowed to expire, the economy could contract by approximately 3 percentage points. That would be a large hit to an economy that is still weak and recovering from the fiscal crisis of 2008. Adding another fiscal crisis by not extending these tax policies definitely won't help and will likely do further damage. So, Mr. President, preventing this tax hike is what we must focus on. Congress should have a laser focus on preventing this looming disaster. Yet at a time when we should be working to prevent a massive tax increase, President Obama and his Democrat allies are spinning their wheels trying to raise taxes on politically unpopular groups. These tax hikes are already scheduled to go into effect. Congress doesn't have to do anything, and everyone will pay more taxes come 2013. Now, that's not a good sign, given that some people have called this a do-nothing Senate. Now, let's just go to the Senate Democratic leadership tax legislation to-do list. I'm sure that some people are tired of the mantra among conservatives that Democrats want to raise your taxes and Republicans don't. But we say it because it's true. All liberal think tanks, at their liberal think tanks, their employees go to work every morning and think about how they can raise taxes so they can spend more. My friends on the other side of the aisle, knowing that their constituents already feel overtaxed, spend countless hours devising ways to raise taxes in a way that hits only politically unpopular groups. And the President is devoting his entire re-election campaign towards tax hiking in the interest of fairness. Here in the Senate, we have already voted twice on my colleague from New Jersey's proposal, Senator Menendez's proposal, to raise taxes on oil and gas companies. That's the first line in this chart. We've had hearings, we've had no markup, but we have had floor work on this. First, we had hearings in the Senate Finance Committee last year. As I said then, that was nothing more than a dog and pony show, and everybody knew it. Then leadership brought the bill directly to the floor, skipping the process of a markup. Last week, we voted for the silly Buffett tax. That's the second line in this Democratic leadership tax legislation to-do list. This is not serious tax policy. The Buffett tax is a statutory talking point, and not a very good one at that. First, the President said that it was all about deficit reduction. When we pointed out to him that it raised only $47 billion in revenue over 10 years, a drop in the bucket given the President's trillions in deficit spending, the White House then shifted gears. Now it was about fairness. But when we pointed out that his redistributionist scheme, if redirected to a lower tax bracket, would only yield $11 per family tax rebate, he criticized Republicans for demonizing him as a class warrior. The president needs to come clean about what the Buffett tax really is. It is nothing less than a second and even more damaging AMT, alternative minimum tax, one that would force many small business owners and job creators to pay a minimum of 30% of their income in taxes. As the Wall Street Journal said on April 10th, quote, the U.S. already has a Buffett rule, the alternative minimum tax that first became law in 1969. The surest prediction in politics is that any tax that starts by hitting the rich ends up hitting the middle class, because that is where the real money is, unquote. And what is really rich about the Buffett rule is that Mr. Buffett would be able to avoid his own Buffett tax. So what is the president doing? Why, with Tax-Mageddon around the corner, are President Obama and his liberal allies dithering with these harmful tax increases? The answer is pure and simple politics. President Obama has read the polls. He knows he's in trouble. His approval rating is declining, and he does not have a single positive accomplishment to run on for a second term. The $800 billion stimulus, a failed policy that has not kept the unemployment rate under 8%. Obamacare, rejected soundly by the American people as evidenced by the 2010 midterm elections. It might now be rejected by the Supreme Court as one of the biggest unconstitutional boondoggle in our nation's history. What else does he have? Absolutely nothing. His fawning admirers might not know it yet, but Mitt Romney is in the catbird seat. President Obama long ago lost independence, so he is appealing to all he has left, core left-wing supporters, one step from an Occupy Wall Street encampment who love class warfare. Before the Buffett rule, Democrats proposed 6 different pieces of legislation that in one form or another raise taxes on millionaires. Here they are. That's the third line in the chart. Millionaire surtax hike bill. Now you notice no hearings on the Buffett rule, no hearing on millionaire surtax hike bill, no markup in the Menendez oil and gas tax hike bill, no markup in the Buffett rule tax hike bill, no markup in millionaire surtax hike bill, but all 3 of them brought to the floor. And every one of these bills was focused on raising taxes to pay for more government spending. Now, let's not pretend that all of these redistributionist tax policies or tax plans comprise serious policy. Now, let's not forget that every minute Democrats spend goofing around with these plans is a minute that we do not spend preventing the largest tax increase in American history. Mr. President, Senate Democrats are fiddling while Rome burns. They have failed to address the deficit. Spending surged 24% under President Obama when he took office. All of the tax hikes he and his allies have proposed do little, if anything, to pay down the deficits and debt. Now it's time for Senate leadership to get serious and to focus on making the lives of middle-class families easier, not more difficult. The policies from the other side do nothing of the sort. If anything, they make them more difficult. Tax-Mageddon is coming. The only good news is that Congress can prevent it and extend tax relief for the middle class. That is where my focus will be for the next 8 months, and I hope that my colleagues will join me in securing the benefits of tax relief for all Americans. Now, you can see here this stimulus proposal. We just list 6 different stimulus proposals: school repairs, infrastructure, etc. Number 2, school repairs, infrastructure. Number 3, payments to unionized teachers. Number 4, infrastructure. Number 5, payroll tax holiday. Number 6, smaller payroll tax holiday. These are proposed marginal tax hikes of 5.6%, 0.5%, 0.7%, 3.25%, and 1.8% for a total of 11.9% plus deduction limitations. It's pathetic. And they don't seem to have an answer other than let's tax more. And we Republicans have found through the years that if we go along with any tax increases, instead of getting the cuts that are always promised, they just spend the money and put us deeper in debt. Now, as you can see, it's time to end this type of foolish behavior. And I hope that our friends on the other side will work with us to do so. Because this country's in real trouble, and there's no reason for it. We could turn it around in a very short time if we got serious about economics and we got serious about the tax situation in this country. And I believe it's time to get serious. I believe that if we don't, we are risking the future of the greatest country in the world. Mr. President, I yield the floor.
Mr. President.
The senator from Delaware.
President, I come to the floor today to talk about the action that was taken here this week by the United States Senate to make sure that the Postal Service has a good chance to return to solvency, be relevant in the 21st century, and to continue to provide a valuable role in helping to support 7 to 8 million jobs in the United States of America. Mr. President, I think I'm going to put that on hold for just a moment and recall the words of a former president, one who left office, not very popular, Harry Truman, but in retrospect is regarded by many as one of the best presidents of the last century. Harry Truman, you remember, used to say that the only thing new in the world is the history we forgot or never learned. And I just want to go back in a few years in history and reflecting on the words of preceding speaker and just say, what can we learn from history? Well, one of the things we can learn is that in the last time we actually had a balanced budget in this country, we had actually 3 of them in the last 3 years of the Clinton administration. He became president in the middle of a recession and left our country with the strongest economy of any nation on earth, most productive workforce on earth, most revered nation on earth, and turned it over to a new president, George W. Bush, one of my colleagues as former governor, and gave to him balanced budgets, strong economy, and 8 years later, we had accumulated more debt, and those 8 years, from 2001 to 2009, we accumulated more debt, I think, than maybe the previous 208 years combined. And President Bush then turned over to President-elect Obama a trillion-dollar deficit and an economy that was in free fall, the worst recession since the Great Depression. And that's where President Obama and Vice President Biden start up in January of 2009. Just keep in mind, the last 6 months of 2008, this country lost 2.5 million jobs. The first 6 months of 2009, this country lost 2.5 million jobs. And that's sort of like where they took the handoff. And I would never attempt to characterize my colleagues' comments a few minutes ago, but I think a little bit of history is not a bad thing there. Interestingly enough, the balanced budget agreement was negotiated by President Clinton's chief of staff, Erskine Bowles. And that's a name we've heard a whole lot in the last year and a half because Erskine Bowles was asked by this president to do a similar kind of thing, try to negotiate a deficit reduction deal along with Alan Simpson, former Republican senator from Wyoming. The two of them were asked to head up a deficit commission of 16 other very good people, very smart people. And the 11 out of the 18, after working at this for about a year, came back and they said, here's what we think is a good way to take $4 or $5 trillion out of the deficit over the next 10 years. And the deficit commission, led by Erskine Bowles and Alan Simpson, recommended that we do so by working on the spending side and on the revenue side. And for every $3 of deficit reduction on the spending side, there'd be $1 of new revenues, not by raising taxes, but actually by lowering somewhat the personal income tax rate, the corporate income tax rate, broadening the base of the tax structure, broadening the base of that income which can be taxed. That is seen by a lot of people as like the grand compromise. Democrats agree to compromise on entitlement program reform in an effort to try to make sure we have Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid 50, 60, 70, 100 years from now. Republicans agree to compromise on tax reform that actually lowers the rates but enables us to generate some additional revenues, $1 new revenue for $3 of spending reductions for deficit reduction. I think that's a smart plan. And I know other people have come forward with their plans since, and I think that's a smart deficit reduction plan. I think that's a good jobs bill. My hope is by the end of this year, when the smoke clears, maybe the elections are over, we will come back to that and use that as maybe our North Star to get us back to fiscal responsibility in this nation. That's not, Mr. President, why I came here, but I think it was maybe appropriate on the heels of our friend and colleague to just maybe set the record straight a little bit. Ironically, Mr. President, yesterday 62 senators voted for postal reform legislation. I appreciate the support of the presiding officer and other colleagues, Democrat and Republican. And that legislation was almost immediately attacked by some of our Republican friends over in the House of Representatives. Our presiding officer and my colleagues know I'm not a real partisan guy. Never have been in this role, governor, and any of the roles I've been privileged to play in Delaware. But our bill was attacked almost immediately by Republican friends over in the House. And because it doesn't do this or didn't do that or whatever the sin might be. Ironically, when we say that, well, where's your bill? How about let's compare our bill to your bill? They haven't passed a bill. And yet they feel at liberty to take all kinds of shots. I don't think they're entirely fair shots, but all kinds of shots at our bill. I had an encouraging conversation this afternoon with the chairman of the relevant committee over in the House, urged him to make sure that they actually move a bill and not just criticize what we've done. There are provisions in our bill that I'm frankly not happy with, and I'm sure there'll be provisions in whatever bill that the House passes that he won't be comfortable with. But at the end of the day, they got to move a bill. They have to say, this is what they're for. We've already said this is what we want to have as our sort of negotiating point in conference going forward. Now we need the House to do the same thing, sooner rather than later. And I'm encouraged that the House is going to take something up by the middle of May. They can do it before that. God bless them. I want to take maybe 5, 6, 7 minutes, Mr. President, to just talk a little bit about what we're trying to do with respect to postal reform. We're trying to right-size the enterprise, much as the auto industry right-sized itself 3, 4 years ago, coming out of bankruptcy. We're trying to modernize the postal industry, and we're also trying to help the Postal Service, encourage the Postal Service to find new ways to use their existing business model, where they're in every community in America, 33,000 post offices, going to every front door, every mailbox in America 5 or 6 days a week. How can they use the business model to make more money, to raise new revenues? What are some of the ways that they can do that? So our legislation really focuses on that. Right-size the enterprise, given the reduction in mail, diversion of mail to the electronic media because of Facebook, Twitter, Internet, all the above. We just communicate differently than we used to. We've got to help them right-size their enterprise and modernize and find new ways to generate revenues. That's really the heart and soul of what we want to do. How do we do that? Well, as it turns out, by luck, the Postal Service in recent years has overpaid its obligation to the federal employee retirement system by a lot. And it turns out by about $11 billion. There's no argument. They've overpaid the money. Postal Service is owed that money by the federal employee retirement system. The Postal Service would like to take that money and use that money for two things. One, to incentivize about 100,000 people, postal employees who are eligible to retire. Not fire them, not lay them off. Say, look, if you'll retire, here's another $25,000. Or if you're close to retirement, we'll give you some extra years of credit. But we'd like for you to retire. Second, the Postal Service has more mail processing centers than they need. A couple of years ago, they had maybe 600 or so. Today, they have a few less than 500. They'd like to get down to about 325 over the next year or two. That would be almost cutting in half the number of mail processing centers that there are around the country, because they don't need them. They don't need them given the volume of mail today. They need mail processing centers, but not as many as they have. And when the Postal Service would close another 150 or so mail processing centers, some people will not be able to work in those mail processing centers, but the Postal Service says, we'll find other jobs for you. You can be a letter carrier. You can work in another part of the Postal Service. You're not going to get fired, but we want to encourage people eligible to retire to retire. The Postal Service also wants to take most of that reimbursement from the federal employee retirement system to pay down their debt to the Treasury. Right now, they've drawn on a $15 billion line of credit. The Postal Service would like to take most of their federal employee retirement system reimbursement, pay off that debt, take care of it. Another thing that they would like to do, a lot of folks around here have been real concerned about the closure of post offices. There's the fear that as many as 3,000 or 4,000 post offices in rural places around the country, where maybe the post office is the center of the town, folks have been concerned that their post office is going to be closed and people will be left without postal service. As it turns out, that ain't going to be the case. What the Postal Service is going to do under our bill is to say to communities, across the country, what they're going to say is, we would like to offer you a menu of options. We'd like to offer you a menu of options to different communities, and among those menus of options that we'd like to offer to those communities are these. Number one, we're not going to close your post office. You can keep your post office open. But in a place where we're paying the postmaster $50,000, $60,000, $70,000 a year to run a post office that sells $15,000 worth of stamps, that doesn't make much sense. Why don't we do this? If that postmaster is eligible to retire, incentivize that postmaster to retire. Let them go off, get their pension, get their benefits, come back and work on a part-time basis. Maybe for 2 hours a day, 4 hours a day, 6 hours a day, run the post office in that community. If that's what the community wants, that's what they get. Some communities might rather put the post office in the supermarket there in their community, or maybe in a drugstore or a convenience store that's open not just 8 hours a day or 6 days a week, open 24/7 maybe. That would be an option to the community. In some communities, they may have like a town hall and some other state or local government businesses, and maybe they could co-locate those with the post office and put them all under one roof, and everybody would save some money, share some space. Another option in some places around the country, maybe Minnesota as well, we have rural letter carriers in Delaware, southern part of our state, offer people the opportunity for rural mail delivery. They wouldn't have to come into town and collect their mail at the post office. They'd be delivered to wherever they live. The idea there is to say to the folks in communities who might be adversely affected, you pick from among this menu of options. Figure out what works for you. And they can even vote by mail and pick their favorite choice. So that's in terms of right-sizing the enterprise, reducing the head count, reducing the number of mail processing centers further by another third, and finding ways to provide more cost-effective mail service in communities across the country. Those are not the heart and soul of what we're trying to do, but they're very, very important. I may mention one or two others if I could. The Postal Service pays twice for health care for the retirees. I'll say that again. Postal Service pays twice for the health care of their retirees. They pay into Medicare, and they pay into the Federal Employee Health Benefit Plan. Twice. The employees don't get the full benefit of that money. The Postal Service certainly doesn't get the full benefit of that money. Most companies in this country, big companies and small ones, when their employees retire, a lot of times they'll continue to provide health care benefits for them until age 65. And then at age 65, the company will say to the retiree, we want you to get your make Medicare your primary source of health care, and we'll provide a wraparound or a Medigap program to fill in the gaps for you. That's how a lot of companies do it. My wife's retired from DuPont. When she turns 65 in about another 30 years, well, maybe a little sooner than that, but when she turns 65, Medicare will be her primary source of health care, and the company will provide a wraparound or Medigap plan. What the Postal Service would like to do is have a similar kind of opportunity. And in the end, I think the retirees will benefit, the Postal Service will benefit, and the taxpayers, I think, arguably would benefit. Those are just a couple of things that are in our legislation. Have we passed a perfect bill? By no means. By no means. As I said earlier, there's some things in the bill that I don't like. And I hope that we can make the bill better in conference. In order to get the conference with the House has to pass a bill. And it's not just enough for the House to criticize what we've done and say, well, what have you done? What's it turned out so far? Not much, at least in terms of passing a bill and being able to appoint conferees and see what we can work out here. My hope is that they'll do that. My hope is they'll do that sooner rather than later. So we can stop saying, well, the Postal Service lost $25 million today, and they did it yesterday and they do it tomorrow. That's not sustainable. That's just not sustainable. And they need to be put in a position where they can be successful. We can help them there. And to the extent that the Postal Service becomes vibrant and solvent, they can help support the 7 or 8 million jobs that are tied or interconnected with the Postal Service. That's what we're trying to do. And with that having been said, Mr. President, I bid you adieu, and note the absence of a quorum.
Clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Akaka.